15-year-old Emma Chun stood frozen in her bedroom doorway, watching her mother collapse to the kitchen floor for the third time that week, blood pooling beneath her bruised face, while her stepfather Richard towered over her with clenched fists, shouting that she deserved every strike for burning his dinner. What Emma didn't know was that in exactly 48 hours, her decision to finally break her silence would either save her mother's life or destroy what remained of their fractured family forever. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe, give this video a like, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. Now let's begin. Emma had learned to move like a ghost through their cramped apartment, her footsteps silent on the creaking floorboards, her breathing shallow whenever Richard came home from another failed job interview, reeking of alcohol and rage. For 3 years since her mother Sarah had remarried, Emma had become an expert at reading the warning signs. The way Richard's jaw twitched when bills arrived in the mail, the particular slump of his shoulders that meant he'd been fired again, the dangerous quiet that settled over their home like fog before a storm, when even the slightest sound could trigger an explosion. Sarah Chun had once been vibrant, a woman who sang while cooking breakfast and danced around the living room to old records. She worked double shifts at the diner downtown, her uniform always spotless despite the grease stains that seemed to follow her home. After Emma's father died in a construction accident when Emma was 12, Sarah had tried her best to hold their world together with nothing but determination and love. But somewhere along the way, that love had transformed into something else entirely. Something that made her accept Richard's first shove as an accident, his first slap as stress, his first punch as something she somehow deserved. Emma watched her mother shrink with each passing month, saw the light fade from her eyes as makeup became a daily necessity to cover the bruises that bloomed across her skin like poisonous flowers. Sarah stopped singing. She stopped dancing. She stopped looking Emma in the eye when she asked if everything was okay, instead whispering that sometimes grown-ups had complicated problems that children couldn't understand. The worst part wasn't even the violence itself, though Emma's stomach churned every time she heard her mother's muffled sobs through the thin walls. The worst part was the isolation that wrapped around their home like barbed wire. Richard had convinced Sarah to cut ties with her sister in California, claiming family was nothing but trouble. He'd convinced her to quit the book club she loved, saying she needed to focus on being a better wife. One by one, Sarah's friends stopped calling, stopped visiting, until it was just the three of them trapped in their suffocating bubble of secrecy. Emma knew that speaking up meant risking everything. If the authorities got involved, where would they go? Their apartment was all they could afford, and without Richard's occasional construction work, they'd be homeless. Sarah had already lost so much weight that her work uniforms hung loose on her frame. Her tips were barely enough to buy groceries. If Emma called for help and Sarah denied everything, would they be split up? Would Emma end up in foster care while her mother stayed, trapped with a man who was slowly killing her? But Emma also knew that staying silent meant watching her mother die by inches. Each bruise was darker than the last, each accident more violent, each excuse more desperate. Sarah had stopped eating dinner, claiming she wasn't hungry, but Emma saw how her hand shook when Richard raised his voice. She noticed how her mother flinched at sudden movements, even from Emma herself. The woman who had once been her whole world was disappearing, replaced by a hollow-eyed stranger who apologized for everything and blamed herself for nothing. Every night, Emma lay in her narrow bed listening to the sounds from the next room and making bargains with God. If her mother could just make it through one more day, Emma would find the courage to act. If the bruises would just fade, maybe things would get better on their own. If Richard would just leave, maybe they could rebuild their lives piece by piece. But the bruises only grew darker, and Richard showed no signs of leaving. And Emma realized that all her prayers were just another form of silence. The stakes were simple and impossible all at once. Stay quiet and lose her mother forever. Speak up and potentially lose everything else. Emma was 15 years old, carrying the weight of an adult decision that would determine whether her family survived or shattered completely. She had exactly 48 hours to choose between the devil she knew and the unknown hell that might await them on the other side of truth. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning when Emma's phone buzzed with a text from her best friend Lily asking why she hadn't been in school for 3 days. Emma stared at the message, realizing she'd lost track of time completely. The bruise on her mother's cheek had been so severe this time that Sarah couldn't face going to work, which meant Richard had been home for 72 straight hours, drinking and prowling through their apartment like a caged animal looking for something to destroy. Emma typed back a lie about the flu, but her fingers trembled as she hit send. She was becoming just like her mother, covering truth with carefully constructed deceptions, building walls of silence brick by brick. The thought terrified her more than Richard's rage ever could. She was 15 years old and already an expert at living in the shadows, at making herself invisible, at pretending everything was fine when her world was crumbling around her. That afternoon, while Richard was passed out on the couch and her mother was hiding in their bedroom with a cold compress pressed to her swollen eye, Emma made a decision that would change everything. She opened her laptop and typed 4 words into the search bar that felt like stepping off a cliff: how to report domestic violence. The websites that populated her screen painted a picture both hopeful and terrifying. There were hotlines she could call, shelters that would take them in, legal protections that could keep Richard away. But there were also statistics that made her blood run cold. Women who left abusive relationships were 75% more likely to be killed by their abusers. The most dangerous time for a victim was immediately after they tried to escape. Emma's hands shook as she read testimonials from other families who had escaped and others who had tried and failed. She learned about restraining orders that were just pieces of paper when faced with a man determined to hurt. She read about women who had been found by their abusers despite new addresses, new names, new lives built from nothing but hope and desperation. But she also read about children who had called for help and saved their mothers' lives, about families who had found safety and rebuilt their relationships on foundations of truth instead of fear, about the organizations that existed specifically to help people like them disappear into new lives where violence couldn't follow. The next morning brought the first rehook that would test Emma's resolve. She woke to the sound of her mother screaming. Racing to the kitchen, Emma found Sarah on the floor, clutching her arm at an unnatural angle, while Richard stood over her screaming about a coffee cup she dropped. The ceramic pieces scattered across the linoleum looked like broken promises, and Emma realized with crystal clarity that this was the moment. Her mother needed medical attention, which meant leaving the apartment, which meant other people would see the bruises, which meant questions that could no longer be deflected with lies about clumsiness and stares. "We have to go to the hospital," Emma said, her voice steadier than she felt. Richard whirled on her, his eyes bloodshot with rage and alcohol. "Mind your own business, kid. Your mother is fine." But Sarah wasn't fine. Her arm was clearly broken, hanging at an angle that made Emma's stomach lurch. Her mother's face was gray with shock and pain, and she was making small whimpering sounds that cut through Emma's heart like glass. "She needs a doctor," Emma insisted, positioning herself between Richard and her mother for the first time in 3 years. The slap came so fast Emma barely saw it coming. Her cheek exploded with pain, and her ear rang like a fire alarm, but she didn't move. Instead, she looked Richard directly in the eyes and said the words that would haunt him forever. "I'm calling 911. The second rehook came when Emma realized that Richard wasn't going to let them leave. As she reached for her phone, Richard grabbed her wrist with enough force to leave bruises shaped like his fingers. His grip was iron, his eyes were wild, and Emma understood with terrifying clarity that she had just escalated a dangerous situation into something potentially deadly. Behind her, Sarah was trying to stand despite her broken arm, whispering Emma's name like a prayer or a warning. "You're not calling anyone," Richard snarled, his breath hot against Emma's face. "You're going to help me get your mother cleaned up, and then we're all going to pretend this never happened. Do you understand me?" Emma looked into his eyes and saw something she'd never seen before: genuine fear. Richard was scared of what would happen if the truth came out, which meant he knew exactly how wrong his actions were. He wasn't just an angry man who'd lost control. He was a predator who had been carefully constructing a web of isolation and control, and Emma had just threatened to tear it apart. But Emma had read those websites. She knew that the most dangerous moment in an abusive relationship was when the victim tried to leave. She also knew that her mother's arm needed immediate medical attention, and that every second they delayed could mean permanent damage. The stakes had just gotten higher, but backing down was no longer an option. With her free hand, Emma managed to grab her phone and speed dial 911. Richard lunged for it, but Emma threw herself sideways, crashing into the kitchen table and sending everything scattering across the floor. The phone skittered under the refrigerator, but not before Emma heard the most beautiful sound in the world. A voice saying, "911, what's your emergency? Help us." Emma screamed as Richard dragged her to her feet. "He's going to kill us." The line went dead, but it was too late for Richard to take back what had been unleashed. Emma had made the call, and somewhere across the city, help was already on its way. The sirens announced themselves 3 blocks away, their wailing cry growing louder with each passing second, like the voice of justice itself, coming to settle old scores. Richard stood frozen in their kitchen, still gripping Emma's wrist, his eyes darting between the window and the door, as if calculating escape routes that didn't exist. Sarah had managed to pull herself into a sitting position against the refrigerator, cradling her broken arm while tears of pain and something that might have been relief streamed down her bruised face. "You have no idea what you've done," Richard whispered, his voice deadly quiet in a way that made Emma's blood freeze. "They'll take you away from her. They'll put you in foster care with strangers who don't give a damn about you. They'll put her in some shelter where she'll get robbed and assaulted by people 10 times worse than me. Is that what you want?" For just a moment, Emma wavered. The sirens were getting closer, but Richard's words dug into every fear she'd been carrying for months. What if he was right? What if she just destroyed their family instead of saving it? What if the system failed them the way it failed so many others? Then she looked at her mother's face, really looked at it, and saw something she hadn't seen in 3 years. Hope. Despite the pain, despite the fear, despite everything they were about to face together, Sarah was looking at her daughter with pride shining through her tears. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you," Sarah whispered, her voice broken, but somehow stronger than Emma had heard it in months. "I'm sorry I made you carry this alone." The front door exploded inward with a crash that shook the entire apartment. 2 police officers rushed in, hands on their weapons, eyes scanning the scene with practiced efficiency. Behind them came paramedics with equipment bags and stretchers, ready to piece together whatever damage they found. Richard finally released Emma's wrist and stepped back, his hands raised in surrender, his expression shifting into the mask of confused innocence he'd perfected over years of practice. "Officers, thank God you're here. My wife fell down the stairs and my stepdaughter panicked. Everything's fine now." But everything wasn't fine, and the officers weren't buying Richard's performance. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, knelt beside Sarah while her partner kept Richard in sight. The paramedic examining Sarah's arm was already calling for additional equipment, his voice tight with professional concern. "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened here?" the female officer asked gently. Sarah looked at Richard, then at Emma, then back at the officer. For a heartbeat that felt like an eternity, Emma thought her mother might retreat back into the familiar safety of lies and denial. But then Sarah took a shaking breath and spoke the words that would finally set them free. "He broke my arm. He's been hitting me for years, and today he hit my daughter too." The transformation in the room was immediate and electric. Richard's mask slipped completely, revealing the rage underneath. But he was surrounded now by people trained to handle men like him. The officers moved with swift precision, one reading him his rights, while the other guided Emma and Sarah away from him. The paramedics worked quickly to stabilize Sarah's arm and document the extent of her injuries. Emma found herself sitting in the back of an ambulance, watching her stepfather being loaded into a police car in handcuffs. He looked smaller somehow, diminished without his audience of terrified victims. The man who had seemed so powerful, so untouchable, was just another pathetic criminal being processed by a system that had seen his kind 1,000 times before. But the real climax came later, in the hospital waiting room, when a social worker named Janet sat down beside Emma, with a clipboard full of forms and a gentle smile that somehow managed to be both professional and genuinely warm. "I know this is overwhelming," Janet said, "but I need you to understand that you saved your mother's life today. The doctor says her arm was broken in 3 places. If she hadn't gotten medical attention, she could have lost the use of it permanently. And the bruising patterns on both of you indicate escalating violence. Things were getting worse, not better." Emma nodded, unable to speak past the tears that had been building behind her eyes for hours. "Your mother is going to need surgery, but she's going to be okay. And while she recovers, we're going to help both of you find a safe place to stay." Richard won't be able to contact either of you. There are organizations that specialize in helping families like yours start over. The word over hit Emma like a physical force. Over. After 3 years of walking on eggshells, of measuring every word and gesture, of living in constant fear, it was finally over. The man who had turned their home into a prison was locked away, and they were free to begin rebuilding their lives from whatever pieces remained. That night, in a hotel room paid for by the Victims Assistance Program, Emma lay in a real bed with clean sheets and listened to her mother sleeping peacefully for the first time in years. Sarah's arm was in a cast and sling. Her face was still swollen with bruises, but she was breathing deeply and steadily, without the constant tension that had become her default state. Emma realized that the climax of their story wasn't just about the dramatic rescue or Richard's arrest. The real climax was this moment of quiet safety, when she could finally close her eyes without listening for the sound of heavy footsteps in the hallway or the crash of something being thrown against the wall. It was the sound of her mother breathing without fear, the feeling of a door that locked from the inside, the knowledge that tomorrow they could begin the work of remembering who they used to be before Richard taught them to be afraid. 6 months later, Emma stood in the kitchen of their new apartment, watching her mother hum while she prepared dinner. It was a simple melody, something Sarah used to sing when Emma was small, and hearing it now felt like watching a flower bloom after a long winter. The apartment was smaller than their old place, furnished with donations and secondhand finds, but belonged to them completely. No one had keys but them. No one raised their voice within these walls. No one walked on eggshells or measured their words for fear of triggering violence. The road to this moment had been neither straight nor easy. Sarah had needed 2 surgeries to repair her arm, followed by months of physical therapy to regain full mobility. Both she and Emma had attended counseling sessions, learning to identify the patterns of trauma that had become so normal they'd forgotten what healthy relationships looked like. There had been nights when Emma woke from nightmares about Richard finding them, and days when Sarah struggled with depression so deep she couldn't get out of bed. The legal process had been its own kind of trauma. Richard had hired a lawyer who tried to paint Sarah as an unstable woman and Emma as a rebellious teenager, making up stories for attention. There were depositions where they had to relive the worst moments of their captivity, cross-examinations designed to make them doubt their own memories, and a system that sometimes felt more interested in processing cases than protecting victims. But there had also been unexpected sources of strength. Janet, the social worker who had become their advocate and guide through the maze of resources available to survivors. Dr. Martinez, the therapist who helped them understand that healing wasn't linear and that setbacks didn't mean failure. The other families they met in support groups, women and children who had walked similar paths and emerged with their own hard-won wisdom about survival and recovery. Emma had returned to school in their new neighborhood, a place where no one knew their story unless they chose to share it. She joined the debate team and discovered she had a talent for public speaking, a gift for taking complex issues and breaking them down in ways people could understand. Her teachers noticed her maturity, her ability to connect with classmates who were struggling with their own family problems, her quiet leadership in group projects and discussions. Sarah had found work at a community center that provided services to domestic violence survivors. Her lived experience, combined with training in crisis intervention, made her uniquely qualified to help other women navigate the early stages of escape and recovery. She worked with families just beginning their journey away from violence, offering practical advice about housing and legal resources, but more importantly, offering hope that life after abuse was not just possible, but could be rich and meaningful. The work was difficult, sometimes triggering memories of her own trauma, but it gave Sarah's suffering purpose. Every woman she helped find safe housing, every child she connected with counseling services, every family she watched take their first tentative steps toward independence validated the decision to break their silence. She was transforming her victimization into a form of service that rippled outward, touching lives she would never know. Richard had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for domestic violence and assault charges. The prosecutor had pushed for a longer sentence, but plea negotiations and overcrowded prisons meant that he would likely be eligible for parole in 3 years. Emma and Sarah had mixed feelings about this outcome. Part of them wanted him locked away forever, But another part recognized that prison was unlikely to change him, and that their real safety came from the restraining orders, the new address, and the skills they'd learned about recognizing and avoiding dangerous relationships in the future. More importantly, they had learned that their safety didn't depend on Richard's location or behavior. It depended on their own choices, their support network, and their commitment to never again accepting treatment that diminished their worth as human beings. They had learned to trust their instincts, to ask for help when they needed it, and to believe that they deserved love that didn't come with conditions or violence. On this particular evening, as Emma helped her mother set the table for their quiet dinner, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrifying Tuesday when she'd finally made the call that saved both their lives. The girl who had lived in constant fear had been replaced by a young woman who understood her own power to effect change, not just in her own life, but in the lives of others who needed someone to believe in them. Emma had started volunteering at the teen center, mentoring younger kids who were dealing with family problems. She taught them about recognizing warning signs of abuse, about the difference between healthy and unhealthy relationships, and about resources available to families in crisis. Some of the kids she worked with were dealing with situations eerily similar to what she'd experienced, and she was able to offer them something precious. Proof that escape was possible and that life on the other side could be better than anything they'd dared to imagine. The phone rang as they sat down to eat, and Emma felt that familiar flutter of anxiety that still accompanied unexpected sounds. But when Sarah answered with a smile, Emma realized it was Lisa, Sarah's sister in California, calling for their weekly check-in. The relationship that Richard had worked so hard to destroy had been rebuilt, strengthened by honesty about what they'd endured and gratitude for the family connections that had helped them heal. After dinner, Emma settled down to work on an essay for her English class about courage. She'd chosen to write about ordinary people who made extraordinary choices, focusing on individuals who spoke up in situations where silence would have been easier. As she wrote, she thought about the 15-year-old girl who had stood in that kitchen 6 months ago, trembling as she dialed 911 while her world exploded around her. That girl had been terrified, uncertain, and overwhelmed by the weight of a decision that felt too big for her young shoulders. But she had also been brave in ways she didn't fully understand at the time. She had chosen truth over comfort, action over paralysis, hope over despair. She had refused to let her mother disappear into the darkness that Richard had tried to wrap around their lives. Emma smiled as she typed her conclusion, realizing that the story she was telling in her essay was also the story of her own transformation. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action in spite of fear. She had discovered that speaking up, even when your voice shakes, can literally save lives. She had come to understand that healing was possible, that families could be rebuilt, and that the worst experiences of our lives could be transformed into sources of strength and service to others. The essay would go on to win a statewide contest for high school students. But more importantly, it would be read by another teenager in another city who was living with abuse and wondering if anyone would believe her if she asked for help. That girl would read Emma's words and find the courage to make her own call for help, continuing the ripple effect of healing that spreads when someone chooses to break the silence that protects perpetrators and isolates victims. As Emma finished her homework that night, she looked across the living room at her mother, who was reading a book by the window, her face relaxed and content in a way that would have been impossible in their old life. They had lost everything they thought they needed and discovered everything they actually needed. They had learned that home wasn't a place, but a feeling, that safety wasn't something you could buy, but something you had to create through choices and boundaries and connections with people who genuinely cared about your well-being. Their story wasn't a fairy tale. There was no perfect ending, no guarantee that life would always be easy or safe. Richard would eventually be released from prison, and they would have to remain vigilant about their safety and privacy. Sarah's recovery from trauma would continue to have ups and downs, moments of strength and periods of vulnerability. Emma would carry the experiences of her adolescence for the rest of her life, and they would shape her relationships and choices in ways both positive and challenging. But their story was also a testament to the power of human resilience, to the possibility of healing, and to the importance of speaking truth even when that truth is painful and complicated. They had learned that love without respect is not love at all. That children should never have to choose between their safety and their family's stability. And that asking for help is not a sign of weakness, but an act of courage that can transform not just your own life, but the lives of countless others who need to know that escape is possible. Their apartment was small and their bank account was smaller, but they had something infinitely more valuable. The knowledge that they had survived the worst thing that could happen to them and emerged stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever to building a life based on truth, respect, and love that never required them to make themselves smaller or quieter or less than they were. Emma turned off her laptop and headed to her bedroom, stopping to kiss her mother goodnight. As she settled into bed, she thought about the girl she'd been 6 months ago and the woman she was becoming. Tomorrow she would go to school, participate in debate practice, help other teenagers recognize their own power to create change. She would live the life that 15-year-old girl had saved when she found the courage to pick up the phone and speak the words that shattered their silence forever. The story of Emma and Sarah's escape from domestic violence was far from unique, but it was also far from over. Every day, they made new choices to prioritize their healing, their safety, and their service to others walking similar paths. They had learned that survival was just the beginning, and that true victory came not from forgetting their past, but from transforming it into a source of strength and wisdom that could light the way for others still trapped in darkness. If this story moved you or reminded you of someone in your own life who might need support, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. Share this story with someone who needs to know that escape is possible, that healing is real, and that speaking up can literally save lives. Your engagement helps us reach more people who need to hear stories of hope and recovery. And together we can continue to break the silence that allows abuse to flourish in the shadows. See you in the next video.